We never felt we were refugees. Maybe because we didn't understand that word.
They feel detached from reality. I felt that at the age of 10 or 12 when I was trying to make sense of the world around me. I couldn't.
You look at the way migrants are now treated from some of the worst stricken places in the world.
Literally, when you're a refugee, you're so busy getting on with life that you don't think of yourself as a refugee.
I didn't know why we were fleeing. It still saddens me to this day that I don't know the answer to that.
I just feel now that we were really lucky to have such a response in spite of the racism.
It's 50 years since I, along with my family and thousands of other Asians, were thrown out of Uganda. For the final part of my series, Exiled, I've been reflecting on this anniversary and asking questions around how our journey of being forced to flee compares to the story of others.
I was born into war. I didn't know any other reality.
I've been hearing from Wahid Aryan, a doctor and author.
There is a pattern to displacement when it comes to the Ugandan Asians, or when we talk about refugees from other places. And that is that, first of all, it's not by choice they leave. Although, they were given 90 days in many other countries, they don't have the time limit. But having said that, it's the same reason that they didn't have a choice. The Ugandan Asians had to leave everything they had to find safety. They were persecuted. So the reasons why refugees leave, that is similar. It's persecution, it is conflict, threat to their lives or to their beliefs.
His story of displacement spanned most of his childhood and teenage years. Born in Kabul in the 1980s, he came to the UK at the age of 15. That was after years of being displaced to Pakistan and within Afghanistan.
Sadly, when people are in conflict zone, they have to be constantly on the move. So my family decided to let go of me when I was 15 years old in 1999. They looked for routes to do that. We went to various embassies. We were not even allowed to go beyond the checkpoints. So when we talk about official routes, we did exhaust those official routes. Then we had to deal with a smuggler. We had to sell the house and whatever belongings my father had. And that was the only route available. And that was not a straightforward journey, because I didn't have the right documentation. I knew about the word refugee because when we first migrated to Pakistan when I was 5 years old, we were called refugees. But when I was traveling to the UK, so the agent who prepared the documentation, he promised that it will be a refugee visa. Although when I came to the UK, I realized soon that actually documentations were not the refugee documents. But when you're living in war, when you're trying to survive, that's the least of your worries, what documents you have. You find a way to run, you find a way to save your life or the life of your child.
I've been thinking about whether I feel or felt that my story and that of my family has similarities to others who've been displaced, with the threat of or facing persecution. And am I, a refugee? Here's journalist and author Yasmin Alibai Brown. Of Indian heritage like me, she left Uganda in her early 20s.
Ugandan Asians in Britain were not refugees. The only Asians from Uganda who were admitted into this country were British passport holders. So we were actually being denied entry into our own country, if you like.
Dr. Simon Nasser is a historian of race and immigration and has been writing about and exploring the history of the Ugandan Asian expulsion.
Many Ugandan Asians had British passports and so don't necessarily fit that definition of a refugee. So what I think is really interesting, especially since Ugandan Asians themselves sometimes label themselves as refugees, is that Ugandan Asians have popularly been represented as refugees, mainly because they were fleeing from desperately difficult circumstances. And I think it's important to listen to those stories and to think about why that's the case.
So while Ugandan Asians with British passports were not technically refugees, as Simon says, there are those who choose to identify themselves in that way, as they were forced to flee.
The path to safety, you just leave however you can. That's why a lot of people, they leave everything behind to get on a boat, on a plane, to find safety. It's an extremely difficult time physically and mentally for them. The Ugandan agents had to leave everything they had to find safety. Also, another pattern that's similar here is that we saw that there was some resistance. They were called invading outsiders and immigrants, flooding and so on. That political narrative or that narrative that was by some right-wing media that was pushed, it was soon overcome by the compassion of the British public, the amazing voluntary service that they had to offer.
When I think about Wahid's story and many others like him, do I feel an affinity? Do I feel lucky that our story was different? After all, some of us had British passports. We could come to the UK. For Wahid, he was fleeing war, conflict. He was displaced throughout his childhood many times. Different to my story. But I think his words on finding safety and feeling like an outsider do ring true. I do feel an affinity, but I don't understand why people fleeing danger, life-threatening situations are treated differently. Makes no sense to me. Here's historian Simon Nasser again.
I think what happened to Ugandan Asians was a historically specific event. And I think in many ways it was tied to the end of empire, which I think sets it apart from other cases of refugee or people seeking asylum. You know, Idi Amin said that Ugandan Asians were Britain's responsibility and there was this connection to empire. And just thinking about contemporary narratives, I think there's a kind of cyclical nature to policy making. Sometimes lessons are learned in positive ways and others not so much. In 1972, when Ugandan Asians were expelled, Britain considered and even asked various territories to take in this community. There were talks about Ugandan Asians being sent to the Falkland or Solomon Islands. And today we're viewing something very similar with the government's proposed migration and economic development partnership with Rwanda. So it's useful to remember, I think, that Ugandan Asians were not on the whole warmly welcomed.
The idea that there was this discussion of sending people like me and other Ugandan Asians to the Falkland Islands upsets me in the same way it upsets me to see talk of refugees today being sent to Rwanda. The feeling that we're not welcomed by some.
The Uganda Resettlement Board, which was set up, were told that they could support people going to particular areas in the UK. Regions were designated as red zones, areas like London, Birmingham and Leicester, and they were deemed as areas that already had a kind of high number of migrants or migrant communities, areas that the housing situation was deemed to be in kind of crisis. And so instead, people were encouraged to settle in green zones, which didn't have a significant or diverse community there at the time. In many ways, it didn't really think about what these communities really needed during this period of kind of intense trauma was to be around family and friends and networks. And so many people actually ignored this advice.
And to think that there were red and green zones in Britain, I ended up in a red one. Leicester, because I think the community support was something we needed, looked for in fact. So 50 years on, what lessons have been or can be learned?
In some ways, it hasn't changed. The attitude that was against the Ugandan Asians coming here.
Haki Kapasi came with her family in 1972 when she was about 9 years old. She spent 3 years researching her Ugandan Asian Muslim community for her book.
I really believe that immigration has been a boon to this country. I find it fascinating that people think of it as negative, as a lessening of things instead of an enriching. It's also been interesting to observe how different refugees have been treated. I mean, the Syrians were treated so badly. I can imagine what trauma they went through when they would come off those horrible dinghy boats and saying, aren't we humans too?
Here's Yasmin and Wahid again.
I think there was still this expectation that the country will welcome us, and the country did. On the whole, very good systems were put into place, camps were created. In some ways, migrants today have a much harder time. Yeah, and I used to go and help in the camps. And you look at the way migrants are now treated from some of the worst stricken places in the world. And I think, oh my God, I used to think this is a humiliating thing, you're putting us into camps. But actually, honestly, it was a very important and helpful stage of settlement. There was such an understanding of what had happened with our people, and that understanding is gone now, except I can see it with the Ukrainian situation, and I'm really pleased that there's some empathy still left.
The narrative over the years for refugees I would say it varies from place to place and from people to people. Here, I would say in the UK, I still think that the majority of the people are welcoming. But sadly, what I see also is discrimination. We have to be extremely careful of how we describe refugees who may not have a similar color to ourselves, who may be coming from far away, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, or somewhere else. They're also human beings.
So I have been asking myself, do I see myself as a refugee? I really don't know the answer to that. I was always told I was. Recently, I was chatting with a refugee from Ukraine. We both spoke to each other about our journeys. It was funny because one of the first things I said to her was that I was a refugee too. I'm not sure if that's because I've been told that or if I really believe that now. And what do I feel can be learnt from our journey as Ugandan Asians forced to flee persecution?
I think people talk a lot about the success story of Ugandan Asians. It wasn't success for everybody. It wasn't great for everybody. It was great for a lot of people. Coming here was great for them, but not necessarily so, not for the children.
With refugees, there is a pattern to the type of traumas they experience. We're physically under harm or under the threat of the harm. So when refugees are given safety, first of all, which is their primary reason for coming to the UK, not to take things away, they will go on to work extremely hard to realize their potential and to contribute to the society. For me to start a new life in the UK as a child refugee with no family support, hardly any education, and $100 in my pocket. What I also brought with me was, like many refugees do, is that determination. So that's another pattern that's similar. These Ugandan Asians, they have shown, they've proven how immigration has actually enriched our society.
50 years on, how do I really feel? Resilience. We made it. Not all of us, but on the whole, we survived. Some thrived, others haven't. But the fact is, we made it. We're here now to stay. We've rebuilt our lives and changed lives too.
So I think historical anniversaries are important because they remind us, they encourage us to engage with our own histories. They encourage conversations amongst families, perhaps for the first time, amongst friends, amongst communities. To remember and to share that story is important. We can take that from the 50th anniversary. It's a difficult history and there is a lot of trauma. It's not an easy story to tell, but I think it's an important one.
For me, it is a story that shouldn't be forgotten, that should be talked about, like all other stories of survival, persecution, for generations to come. It's about sharing those stories, and not just the numbers. Opening up conversations, learning lessons of how to treat people, no matter where you're from, with love, respect, and dignity.
When people go through traumas related to conflict, to persecution, to displacement, they are there for life, and hence it's so important to use the correct language to welcome people, treat them as human beings, not allow them to be re-traumatized again.
Exiled, a journey with me, Rupal Rajani. Stories of Ugandan Asians 50 years on.